ninjiyalene. Tata mawelo njiyane njiyalene. Wamanu kato moli mekoli koli ribeyahu. Rena moko moli mekoli koli rena beyahu. Rene ne juju kena mevembe wane ya enebe ya mango. Jie mokona mono.
Good morning, Eric.
Good morning, Taz.
Okay, so I have a few questions for you, if that's okay.
All right.
So the first question is, who or what inspired you to write?
To be honest with you, when I was about 7, 8 years old, my brother bought me a book, or he brought the book to the house, called Swahili Songs of Love and Passion. And I was fascinated by Swahili, and it was translated into English. So I struggled, but I never understood what the Swahili version was saying. But the English version made so much sense, so much so that it inspired me to write a poem dedicated to my mother. So that evening, she gathered her children in the kitchen, and she was so excited. So Eric, can you write this poem? Can you read the poem to us? And I was like, yeah, man, no worries. And the poem went something like, "Dearest mother, you are as beautiful as the snowflakes of Siberia. Everybody knows where you are. No one dares." So my mother just left the kitchen. She went and packed my small bag, and she kicked me out of the house because she thought I was making a mockery of the fact that many men came and left her birth chambers, and that was my first attraction into creative writing.
That's a fascinating story in terms of how you came to writing. Can you remember the very first poem or story that you wrote?
Yes.
What was it about?
I remember very, very well. In fact, it was many, after 2 years and 2 months in Russia, I eventually ended up in Wales. But I was so confused because the time that I spent in Russia was so horrible that all I wanted to do was to go back to Cameroon and commit mass murder as I'd always wanted. I had so much bile and so much venom. But when I arrived in Wales in 2001, 2002, I was invited to a conference in Llandudno, and it was organized by then Literature Wales under the auspices of one Welsh writer called Peter Finch.
He's very well known within the poetry.
Exactly. And we had not known each other. He had just heard about Eric. And so he invited me to this conference in Llandudno. And at this conference, I heard Kate Addy, the BBC journalist, and she had just come back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and she spoke about the Taliban. She spoke about wars and the traumas of war. But I didn't know what the word trauma was. And then there was this other writer friend of mine, Fazana, and Fazana was a victim of human trafficking. But she left Afghanistan. Her father died in Uzbekistan. So in order to pay the human traffickers, Fazana's mother allowed herself to be raped by human traffickers. Eventually, Fazana's mother became blind by the time they reached Turkey. So as Fazana was telling this story, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, maybe Fazana's mother's blindness was deliberate, because she did not wish to see what the human traffickers taking turns ejaculating all over her. And I remember that behind my mother's house, we have one of the biggest trees in sub-Saharan Africa, and this tree is called the Iroko tree. But on the side of this tree, there's a stick insect. We call it the molikilikili. So it is always on this tree, you see. But nobody stops to inquire as to what it is doing. But it looks like it's doing a ritual press-ups, until one day the millipede stops and inquires as to what the moleculically is doing to this tree. So the moleculically got excited because nobody had ever stopped to question it. So it tells the millipede that, listen, this tree has been blocking my sun for 400 years. My crops no longer grow. I cannot plant my seeds. So I'm going to push this tree until it falls to the ground. So the millipede looks at the stick insect and shakes its head and goes away. 3 months later, on its way back from market, it sees the stick insect and it is still pushing this tree. So it calls attention to the fact that, look at how small your hands are, look at how small your feathers are. By the time you push this tree to the ground, you will be dead, your generation will be dead. 400 years later, this tree will still be here. So the millipede walks off. 3 months later, on its way back, the stick insect is still pushing this tree. So the millipede does something, and I can only do this in Bakore. It says, Ebunda watate wakowa wa mawe wa romelelete wa wandi malua enulia mato enulia miro narawe ya ma molikili kama. The molikili insisting on pushing this tree down drives the millipede mad so much so that the millipede invokes the gods and begs the god to render it blind and deaf because it did not wish to see what the stick insect was doing to this tree. And it invokes this question: can blindness be desired? If so, what have those eyes seen to desire to see no more? And I was thinking to myself about this story and the fact that maybe Fazana's mother's blindness was deliberate because of what she's been through. She'd rather be blind and deaf. So as we're traveling back from Swansea to Llandudno, or from Llandudno to Swansea, I kind of had my first epiphany. And the very first poetry anthology I brought out in 2003 then was called, it's called Between a Mountain and a Sea. That was the very first moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, I have arrived. And Wales was my starting point. So in that poem there's a line that says, on a wet journey from Llandudno, washing away pain and longing, a reborn voice is crying between a mountain and a sea, where voices echoed across horizons and conversations on common things. Please wake me from my slumber, and this poem will be over. Between a mountain and a sea, that for my homecoming.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I've always loved your references to this moleculically. So,
I like the moleculically.
Yes, and you do make a lot of references, and thank you for explaining it because of course in our conversations before I've asked about it, but you haven't really provided a detailed an answer.
That's it. I like the molecular in a way. The molecular has resurrected in me.
Yes.
And even recently, I did a collaboration with an artist in Machynlleth called Nikki Ascott, a wonderful poet and comic. She does this thing, and she has resurrected the molecular because the molecular is an insect full of resilience. She does things. She resists things. She asks challenging questions. She challenges the gods, and in a kind of a way, the story of the molecular is symbolic of my story.
Okay, so obviously you mentioned a few writers in the process of this conversation. Who are the writers that you admire the most in terms of that people you may want to emulate?
To emulate these writers will be a feat that I don't think I'll be able to put, but so far as I can get close to how they write.
I think you underestimate your ability.
Thank you very much. To be honest with you, it was only until recently that I started acquainting myself with Cameroonian writing. So the people who have influenced me, when I read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, it kind of changed my life. But I try to emulate the writing style of Sage Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I love Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I love Dreams in Times of War or In the House of the Interpreter. How Ngugi balances British hegemony in Kenya and the fact that he went to a British school while his brother was being chased around the country as somebody who belongs to the Mau Maus. But Bugi write these things, these dark chapters of Kenyan history with great humor, so he puts the reader at ease. And these are the people that I really bought not controversially. By the time one does A levels in Cameroon, you're already acquainted with the writings of Shakespeare, John Keats, W.B. Yeats, Tennyson. So when you are in Form 3, a Form 3 literature child in Cameroon is able to talk about, oh, how can Eldie knight at arms, alone and palely loitering, the sea shall withered from the sea, and no bird sings. But they cannot remember the drum tones of Ekule Kule. They cannot remember the drum tones of Yomandene. They cannot understand the tones of Motimbili, the gods who comes and goes. They can't. So in terms of African literature, those are my gods. In terms of European literature, I met some great writers here in Wales. The irony is, colonial wings brought me writers like the guy who Wilfred Owen, Dolce et Decorum est pro patria more. But when I came to Wales, I got to know about the Welsh poet Hedwyn, and I love his writing very, very much. But for those writers who are alive, I like the work of Graham Davies, who kind of took me under his wings in 2001 and kind of educated me. I love the writings of John Gower. I love the writings of Owen Shears. I love the writings. I don't know. There are plenty of Welsh writers whose writings I like. I love the national poet of Wales, Ivor Ap Glyn. He wrote a beautiful poem which is called "This House." We have translated that poem in Bakweri, and in Bakweri it means Ene Ndao. And in the last stanza of this poem, Ivor says, "Sooner shall two men come together than two mountains." And I like that very, very much.
There was a 13th, 14th century poet called John Gower. He was a contemporary of Chaucer.
Yes.
Only a few poems have survived, but in terms of your journey, what you kind of write about, I often kind of think of, so when you mentioned the President John Gower,
yes,
I thought of that kind of, the John Gower of the peasant revolution, the peasant rebellion of many years ago.
Yes. But this John Gower only lives up the road.
Okay. Well, maybe he might be worth interviewing for one of these segments another time. Okay, well, I followed you quite a bit, with much interest through your journey through this year's Hay Festival, and you were updating us about basically what was going on within how you saw the Hay Festival, particularly your play, and I think it was called The Last Ritual. Would you like to tell us a little bit about The Last Ritual, please?
The Last Ritual is basically my last memory of home. And it's just one of the darkest moments of my life, because the things that take place in the Last Ritual and eventually the outcome of that court case was the first time I felt as if I had been decapitated. And it was for the second time my father died. And for the first time I started deliberately lobotomizing the memory of my father. For the first time, I kind of hated my father's family so much. I developed a bile so poisonous it will make the bite of a black mamba to be, So the Last Ritual is an extremely dark piece. The Last Ritual, I ended up in a place called Tiko in the Southwest, where my mother literally handed me to somebody who practices witchcraft. But till date, my mother does not actually know what actually happened. My part of my body was slashed, and I was taken to a children's cemetery where my blood would flow into children's grave, and I saw ants and maggots making merry with my blood. But eventually we lost this case because it boiled down to one question. After listening to evidence for 3 days, me justifying that I was my father's son, the judge asked my father's family, so the 3 who were in court. So he asked Auntie Sarah that, Ngalle Charles, the young man sitting next to you, do you know this child? Now, these are people that I grew up with. I spent 17 years of my life loving them, cooking with them, chasing rat moles with them, fishing with them. My auntie rejected me. She said, no, I don't know this boy. So did my uncle. But the worst thing was my sister, Catherine. Upon giving birth to Catherine, Catherine's mother died. So my father brought Catherine up as his daughter, and I grew up knowing that Catherine is my sister. But the judge looked at her and asked the same question. Catherine, the boy sitting next to you, do you know him? My sister avoided my gaze. She paid attention to the judge and she rejected me. And then the worst thing is, the people who had come to support my mom then went and were supporting my father's family. By the time we got back to the village, all the local town criers, they were mocking my mom. Now, seeing one's mother cry is never a good sight. Then I decided that I was going to initiate a pogrom. So in the middle of the night, when all was quiet and only shadows lurked outside my father's house, I armed myself with a can of petrol and a box of matches. And this is where the last ritual ends. There, because I was going to initiate a pogrom. So if the play that comes after the last ritual then starts with a sequence where I am telling, in my state of mind, and I'm saying, are those not my sisters I see? Are those not my uncles I see? That in this kitchen is our family shrine. Behind this kitchen is my father's grave, and my grandmother, my aunties, my uncles, my sisters will be joining them soon. For I was hellbound of that, I was certain. So I'm initiating this thing so much so that the only thing that saves me was a moment where, as I stood there, a can of petrol in one hand, a box of matches in the other hand, gazing at my father's house with deadly intent, madness in my heart, murder in my soul. Even the night was silent, as if it were holding its breath. And the moon could not bear to watch, as it hid behind angry clouds, the likes of which seldom trouble African skies. But as I stepped forward to set the wheels in motion that will carry me into damnation, I could hear my mother's voice piercing through the clouds. My mother cried in the language of my ancestors and those before her. My mother cried, Agbe wolo atimbangundu, Agbe wolo atimbangundu. But as I turned around, following my mother towards her house, there was no new dawn seeping through the horizon. You see, my mother's voice may have haunted my actions on that day, but I promised myself that I, Ngalle Charles, I will have my revenge in this life and not wait for the next.
Wow, fascinating as ever. You have this gift of storytelling. I wanted to kind of touch on something you mentioned earlier on about sort of experience of Hay Festival, and of course you were a writer in residence at the Hay Festival this year in 2019. So what was that experience like?
The first time I went there, I was there last year. I was part of the Writers at Work residency scheme last year and this year. It was a great experience, and what the Hay Festival has done with Arts Council of Wales and Literature of Wales is to bring all of us in this 10 days intensive program where most of the writers who come to Hay Festival actually come and see us. The educators, the directors, they give us guidance, and we keep in touch with these writers. So it is one of those experiences, like for example, this is the, until then, I have never attended a creative writing course or a creative writing workshop, but seeing people who know the art of writing, like, it's kind of opened the floodgates of my creativity. Otherwise, I would have been, but the residency, if you can get in, please do. It's a whole different experience. You meet writers at the far end of their career. We all interact. We share ideas. We give creative feedback, constructive feedback. and long may the residency continue. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question is a reference to your grandmother. You mention your grandmother so often. So obviously there's a great love for your grandmother in your heart. But would you like to tell me a little bit about your grandmother's influence in your writing, please?
This is the one thing, until recently, I never knew what my grandmother's name is, because we don't call our matriarchs by their name. We call them Bombo, which means mother of many children. We call them Iya, which means mother of many children. So we just call grandmother Bombo. But my grandmother is so unique because my mother worked to take care of her 6 children, and my grandmother was always home. So my grandmother told us all kinds of stories that stretch our imagination far and here, stories that migrated, took us to foreign lands and brought us back. So my grandmother to me is the person that is holding half of my umbilical cord, and even though she's long gone, I when I'm performing poetry, performing plays on stage, I sing some of the songs that she taught me, because that is when I'm at my most comfortable. This is yes, I mean the closest bond, my grandmother, my mother, my daughter, these are the people who motivate me in life. But to go to my place of peace, my place of comfort, is to sit by the fire watching those 3 stones as my grandmother cooked.
Okay, Eric, and so this is the very, very last question, really, and this is sort of based on kind of your writing journey. Do you have any advice for young writers, anybody starting out?
Of course I do. The one thing that I have learned is to read a lot about not just the art of writing, read about other people's work, read how they work, read how they see the world. If you are born in Cardiff or Combran or in Cameroon, do something. And there's this Welsh writer called Rhiannon Hussein, and in one of her poems she says, take a moment, follow a stranger in your city, and you will learn so many different things about your city that you never knew. And that is how I do it. But there is no secret to it. If you want to be a wonderful writer, you have to be a great reader. You have to, that is it, you have to immerse yourself. You can be a born writer, but your perspective will be very narrow if you're only writing about Combran, or if you're only writing about Ili, or if you're only writing about Kafili. But if you read about the Cameroonian writers, then it opens your perspective. I met a guy in Malta that was my friend, but when she was speaking in the audience, she said the Maltese language is a language that he associated with his father hitting his mom. So Maltese language for him was a language of abuse, a language of torture. But now he's writing in Maltese. But initially, as a writer, he could not write in Maltese because Maltese was a language that he cannot. So as a young writer, you remember in Bakuri say, "Nakwa nateme." I fall, I stand. Life is a struggle. That's it. You don't just sit in your room and imagine. Go out there, interact. Write about different perspectives, and don't box yourself. Don't just say I'm a poet. Yes, we all love poetry. Don't just say I'm a playwright. Write across genre. Play the drums. Dancers will come.
Okay, thank you ever so much, Eric. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So how long have you been planning this?
Well, as you know, we started talking, I think it was maybe in summer when you just finished your Hay Festival sort of residency, yes. And of course then I became busy and you had so much, and of course you are always so busy, so it's a real pleasure.
Yeah, I'm building a bridge between Cameroon and...
A literary bridge?
Yes, a literary bridge, and it doesn't matter who crosses.
It's fascinating. Thank you again, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.